Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. With me is a return guest, Lisa Graves. How you doing, Lisa?
I'm doing well. Nice to see you, Lauren.
Yeah, the last time you were on was about 4 years ago, and we were discussing Brett Kavanaugh.
Oh my goodness, I can't believe it's been that long. You've moved across the country. I'm sorry we have not done another show. I pledged to not make it so long between this one and the next one.
Well, you've got a lot going on, and we're going to talk about one thing, the independent state legislature theory. But if we have time, we're going to get to a couple of other things that you've been working on. But I'm going to not read your extensive bio, which is so extensive. I'm going to put it into the comments because you're extremely accomplished. But bottom line is, I knew you when you were executive director of the Center for Media and Democracy. And a few years ago, you started True North Research, and you're continuing to do the same kind of work that you've been done, tracking our democracy and threats to democracy. I think we first met with the Koch brothers. You were instrumental in uncovering the Koch brothers and all the nefarious things they did. So anyway, this independent state legislature theory, how I got interested in it was, I moved to North Carolina, and the GOP controls the state legislature here, even though we have a Democratic governor who currently can veto a lot of the worst things that they do. But they passed some very bad partisan gerrymandering that was very racist. And it was stopped by the state Supreme Court, which has a majority of Democrats currently, which they could lose in 2020. But the state appealed to the Supreme Court, which had refused to do a stay. But then in early July, they decided that they would hear this case in the next session. And it is expected that this thing that we've been calling the independent state legislature theory is going to be invoked. So what exactly is this theory, and how could it be used to overrule the state Supreme Court?
Well, I really appreciate the question, Lauren, and the introduction. And I also appreciate very much that you are calling it a theory, because that's exactly what it is. Unfortunately, some of the reporting has described it as a doctrine, which would be a very inaccurate description of it. It's basically a claim that was floated by William Rehnquist, who was previously on the Supreme Court. He was put on the court by Richard Nixon, and then he was promoted to Chief Justice by Ronald Reagan. And in the Bush versus Gore decision, where the court stopped the counting of votes in Florida, and in essence which was the effect of declaring George W. Bush the winner before the votes were counted. And as you may recall, after the votes were counted, it was clear that Al Gore would have won not only the popular vote, but the Electoral College vote, but for the Supreme Court's intervention. Anyway, in that case, in Rehnquist's opinion, he floated this idea that perhaps only legislatures could make rules about elections. And he cited Section 4 of the Constitution. This is Section 4 of Article 1 of the Constitution, which says the time, place, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except for the place for choosing senators. So that's the whole sentence. What has happened is that clause has been embraced suddenly by the far right, and they have, and Republican lawyers, including John Eastman, and right-wing Supreme Court justices such as Samuel Alito, and Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch, it seems, and certainly Clarence Thomas, who is one of the most extreme justices ever appointed to the Supreme Court in this century. They have signaled their interest in John Eastman's really fringe legal theories, which he was also using to attack the election results in 2020. And the sort of nutshell of it is that this is just an extraordinary and outlandish and outrageous and discredited claim or theory, because what it would do, in essence, is take that one phrase in the Constitution and assert that no other official in a state could, basically issue rules about elections, including, ballot locations and early voting, or in almost every state in the country. Uh, Literally for decades, in fact, centuries, courts have been ruling on about elections, and no one until this really just terrible fringe right-wing partisan lawyer John Eastman, who tried to help create a coup in the United States, aiding Donald Trump. No one has accepted this theory as binding. It would basically say that of all the clauses in the Constitution, this one forbids judges and courts from looking at what's happening in our elections, whether the elections are fair or not, whether the maps are fair or not, whether they are consistent with longstanding either statutory law or case law. And so it's a terrible, horrifying theory that, if it were adopted by this faction, this right-wing faction that has been installed on our U.S. Supreme Court, it would basically allow these Republican state legislatures in the 2024 election to set aside the vote of the people of America and choose for themselves who they want to be president, if those legislatures chose to do so.
Now, the Brennan Center did a great article on this, in which they had a good paragraph or two about why the founders of the Constitution, or I should say of the country, would not be in favor of giving this much power to state legislatures. And considering these Republicans are supposed to be such originalists or strict constructionists, or whatever term you want to use, history should play a role. Are you able to speak to some of that early history about why? I mean, it's the basic foundation of our whole federalist system.
Well, that's right. I mean, the claims that these judges who were handpicked by Leonard Leo for Donald Trump to choose from, Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, that they're somehow originalists, and they have this allegiance to what the founders thought, or what they think the founders thought. First of all, I mean, that's just not, that's their shtick, but it's not accurate. They're results oriented, and they're willing to do whatever they can to achieve their political agenda. The reason why they were chosen for the court, the reason why they were thought to be sure bets or sure things by Leonard Leo and his secret funders, his billionaire backers that are kept secret from the public, who helped get them installed on the court. But the fact is that not that I give full weight to the views of this founding generation. The fact is that we had before the Constitution, we had an Articles of Confederation, which was a much looser tie between these states, and a very weak federal government. And there were certainly legislatures that were doing an array of things that were, causing, I think, some real difficulties. One of the things that happened in the Constitutional Convention back now more than 200 years ago, coming up on 250 years ago, was that there was a desire to, create rules that would create a stronger federal government, that would secure Congress as having a primary role in our elections. That's why the second clause of Section 4 of Article 1 of the Constitution fully empowers Congress to displace the machinations of state legislatures. So this Congress, our Congress that has been sworn in, or the next Congress, could certainly change the rules, could set new rules, could displace the outrageous actions or efforts of overreach by these partisan right-wing legislatures, if they have the votes to do so, if they have enough Democratic members who are willing to stand up to Trump's tactics, this tactic that has been pursued by John Eastman on Trump's behalf and rejected, and that was rejected in essence by the Supreme Court of North Carolina and more. But there are challenges in this 50-50 Senate in terms of Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and their willingness to try to protect, to do anything to protect the right to vote. So on the one hand, the Constitution clearly sets forth a distrust of these state legislatures and expressly allows Congress to overrule them. And on the other hand, Congress has been broken. The Senate is very much a broken institution because of the filibuster. And even though the Democrats were able to secure power in the Senate, meaning they can hold hearings, they have the gavel to hold hearings, and they have a tie-breaking vote if the vote splits 50-50 and Kamala Harris, the vice president, casts the tie-breaking vote. The reality is that a 50-50 Senate, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, isn't real power. You actually need more members of your party to be in power in order to have a real governing majority because of the power of the filibuster, the power to block legislation or block impeachment, a whole set of things. So as you point out, Lauren, the Brennan Center has done a fantastic job at looking at the history, the perception of some of the founders, their concerns about state legislatures, and in essence, the sort of the reasoning behind that clause in Article 1, Section 4. But the reality is that no court has embraced this ridiculous, outrageous fringe theory that the Republicans in the state of North Carolina are peddling, and that they are echoing the John Eastman theory, the sort of William Rehnquist, Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, fever dream theory that somehow they can use this single clause to destroy decades, if not centuries, of law about the role of the courts and other branches in our government in helping to administer elections. And they're doing it because they have a result they want.
Now, this theory was rejected by the Supreme Court as recently as 2015 in a case from Arizona, but it was a very slim majority, 5-4. Now we have Amy Barrett on the court. Do you think that they're going to use this theory and they're going to overrule the North Carolina Supreme Court?
I'm deeply concerned that they'll do that, Lauren, because this court, as we saw with this term, which is the first full term with Amy Coney Barrett on it, has indicated that it has zero allegiance to precedent, no matter how old or how recent that precedent is. They have signaled quite clearly that they are willing to supplant longstanding legal precedents with their personal views. In the case of Roe, their personal religious views to try to impose their own sort of theocratic view of the law on all Americans and overrule 49 years of precedent that has been honored by Republican and Democratic justices appointed, people appointed by Republicans and Democrats, including the author of Roe, Justice Harry Blackmun, who was a Republican appointee of Richard Nixon and who was previously the general counsel for the Mayo Clinic. And so Roe, they were willing to throw out. Look at what John Roberts did to the Voting Rights Act a few years ago in 2013. He took it upon himself before Amy Coney Barrett got to the court with the 5 Republican appointees on that court at that time. And he decided to overrule a congressional determination back in 2007 that the Voting Rights Act required, required continued oversight in order to protect Americans' right to vote. And so in 2007, Congress issued findings of fact, and it extended the Voting Rights Act enforcement provisions for 25 years. But just a few years later, when John Roberts had the chance, he basically destroyed Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, and that has allowed this wave of voter suppression laws to take hold. You can look at the same thing in Citizens United, where the Roberts Court decided to overturn decades of legal precedent of deference to Congress in trying to prevent corruption through campaign finance laws, common sense rules that if you're running ads around an election, talking about candidates, you're probably trying to influence that election, unless you're, and not the narrow rule that you're only doing so if you say vote for or against. Congress was trying to get at common sense rules to protect dark money from flooding our elections, and John Roberts, the Roberts Court, overruled that. Look at the decision also from a month ago, where the Supreme Court, this faction in the court, the Roberts Court, decided to overrule decades of legal precedent in New York about the carrying of weapons, concealed carry of weapons that they've had a law on the books for years and years and years. But this court decided to set aside decades of law to destroy longstanding precedents that New York had been relying upon to protect its citizenry from, an increased number of people carrying weapons that could kill other people. If you look at gun rights, voting rights, redistricting, anti-corruption law, women's reproductive rights, what you see is a court, the Roberts Court, that is determined to overturn a century of precedent, perhaps. And we know that in part because Leonard Leo, the dark money sort of guru of this court capture scheme, as Senator Whitehouse has described it, bragged to the Council on National Policy, which was a group created by white evangelical Christians who thought Reagan wasn't going to go far enough. He told the Council on National Policy in 2019, after Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed, that the United States Supreme Court was at the precipice of what he called the revival of what he called the structural constitution, and that the people in that room had not lived long enough to see the kind of revolution that this court was about to impose. And so with the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, they have a 6-3 majority, this extremist faction. And I don't think that we have any basis for having any confidence that this court, this faction, will defer to the precedents that say, in essence, that this independent legislative theory, this theory that these legislatures have sole untrammeled power, that they will defer to precedent. I'm very concerned that they will, in fact, overrule precedent in order to try to give their party, the party they hail from, the power to destroy popular rule in America, popular voting in America.
Now let's talk about how this was used in 2020, how Trump's advisors, and there was a great article in Politico about Mike Lee and how he, at the last minute, he voted against it, but all the while he was trying to advise them on it. So he was in as deep as anybody. Seems to me that the, January 6th commission is focusing on the wrong thing, like whether Trump tried to incite that riot. I think it's going to be very hard to prove, being a First Amendment person myself. I think what they should be focusing on is what they tried to do with the electors using this theory, and what they are really putting in place to do in 2024. And your group, True North Research, wrote about 440 bills that they're putting forth. Can you talk about what they did, how they used it in 2020, why it didn't work then, but why it could potentially work in 2024, and what we can do about it?
Well, there's a couple threads there. One is that, as you point out, Lauren, the fact is that the claims of John Eastman and Trump's legal team, Rudy Giuliani and the whole gang, they were rejected over and over and over again by every court that considered them. State court, federal court. They trotted this out. They tried to use these claims to stop Pennsylvania, for example, from trying to make sure that people could vote in the middle of the pandemic. Remember that in September, October, November of 2020, by then, I think almost 500,000 Americans had died in a very short period. It was definitely in the hundreds of thousands. There was no vaccine. Nursing homes were decimated. The hospitals were filled with very sick people who had caught this deadly and very infectious disease. And the courts were trying to make sure that people who wanted to vote in the presidential election and the elections down the ticket had the opportunity to vote. And so they were hearing claims from parties about, could there be longer periods for vote, or can there be absentee ballots, those sorts of things. And the Trump people were trying to stop that at every turn. And Trump was lying to the American people over and over and again, claiming there was going to be widespread voter fraud through mail-in voting, where the court, the clerk mails you your ballot at your house and you mail it back. And all of those claims were deceitful, deceptive, and they've been debunked. But the bigger point, to your point, was the efforts to use these sorts of theories, like this independent state legislature theory, were rejected by the courts. And then what happened on January 6th was not just this violent insurrection, this attempted coup, this incitement of not just a riot, but perhaps a blessing on assassinating Mike Pence, which I think is a very serious matter, and trying to stop the votes from being counted that day in Washington. That's not all that happened that day. That morning, when Donald Trump gave his speech, where he did incite that crowd, he also laid out a program of laws that he wanted his fellow Trumpster Republican legislators to adopt. And so what we've documented is, along with the Brennan Center and other organizations, is how many of these bills to make it harder for Americans to vote, to change the mechanisms in our elections, have been introduced. And as of earlier this year, it was more than 400 bills that were aligned with the actual speech that Trump gave that day. We've documented that alignment on our site, truenorthresearch.org. They have pushed forward his agenda to try to change the state law, to change the rules of the game, to try to make it harder for Americans to vote and make it easier for right-wing legislators to supplant the will of the people. And so the risk is that this extremist faction of our Supreme Court that has a majority of votes will disregard, a century of precedent, if not more, and basically put their thumbs on the scale of justice to assert, and in essence declare, that state legislatures are the only ones who can make rules about elections, and no court can overturn them ever for any reason. And no Secretary of State or Attorney General of the state has any power to countermand or counteract those dictates, even if by statute those legislatures have given them such powers. So it really is a situation where they, may be aiming for sort of a legal coup, although I wouldn't really call it legal in a normal sense, but trying to use the Supreme Court to accomplish what they could not accomplish through their litigation during the 2020 election, where the Trump lawyers were rejected at every single turn.
But talk about how this affects the electors, because a lot of people don't know what electors do. Apparently, if this thing gets invoked, they can decertify like what they wanted to do in 2020 was decertify the electors that said that Biden won and put in their own electors. How are they trying right now in various states to infiltrate that process? Also, what are they doing with regard to, like already in North Carolina, I learned that prior to, I think it was 2018, the judges were not partisan. They didn't have to declare their party, but they found that people were mistakenly voting for Democrats. So they wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. And so they're making they're doing a lot of intimidation with local election officials and trying to drum these people out that are just they're not partisan, they're just concerned about, the integrity of the election, making sure it's fair, similar to what they're doing with school boards, trying to put in these ideologues, because the Republicans are very good at starting at the local level and working their way up. The Democrats haven't quite mastered how to do that yet. Talk about some of the specific things that they're doing, and also some of these other kinds of laws, whether it's, vote by mail or voter ID, getting rid of the good stuff, putting in the bad stuff. Talk about some of that.
Well, I appreciate that, Lauren, and also what you said in the previous question about, the importance of these sort of fake electors, this scheme, because it really is an illegal scheme. And they knew it was illegal. That's why they were trying to keep it secret and have these people somehow, like in Michigan, that they wanted to sneak into the Capitol at night to cast their votes. In other states, they were, told to, not tell anyone that they were a secret elector because it was illegal. It was an illegal scheme based on everything we've seen. And in fact, there appears to be, it appears likely that there's a grand jury investigation going on right now that could result in indictments about that very scheme. And so, for the presidential election, the system in the United States is sort of a dual system where there is a popular vote. We all have the opportunity to vote for president. And then in most states, there's in most states, there's sort of a formal decision by law that the electors will, in essence, represent the popular vote in terms of the electoral college vote. And in some states, it's just a tradition that that's the case. And there occasionally, rarely, have been what they call faithless electors. Someone becomes an elector and fails to vote in accordance with how the state voted. But increasingly over the last, several years, if not decades, states have been even entering into specific agreements to say that they will definitely cast electoral votes in accordance with the popular vote in the states. And so we do have this sort of archaic remnant from the original Constitution in which the electoral votes are the ones that actually decide who becomes president. And that's why that decision to certify those votes back in December, when Trump issued his call to go to Washington on January 6th, was after he basically lost. He was going to lose because the claims of fraud were bogus. They were baseless. There's no evidence of any widespread fraud. It was debunked time and again, even by Republican elected officials like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, that this was just a bunch of nonsense. As Bill Barr said, a person who I don't credit with a lot of credibility given his track record, but who in this instance was telling the truth. There was not a basis for continuing to challenge the election after those electors cast their votes that day. So it's a really significant issue to have a conspiracy, and I would say a criminal conspiracy, orchestrated by the president with the assistance of his lawyers to try to get people to secretly cast a separate ballot when they're not designated electors by anyone official, and then try to get those electors in front of Mike Pence, who is the vice president, and have him somehow declare some confusion about which is the proper slate of electors, and then use that as the basis for stopping the counting of the vote and keeping Donald Trump in power. In fact, there are two components in my home state here in Wisconsin. One is that Ron Johnson, as Lauren Windsor, got on tape, he knew that he was trying to get those fake electors into the hands of Mike Pence, and he engaged in that scheme. He said it was only for 5 minutes. There's no actual 5-minute exception for breaking the law, by the way. You don't get the 5-minute rule for, I guess dropping a chip on the ground or something. That's not how the world works. But secondly, just this past week, a week or so ago, Donald Trump again was calling on the Wisconsin legislature, Robin Voss, a right-wing Republican who's an ALEC member, who has, done his service to Donald Trump at almost every turn, but he has refused to certify the Wisconsin election because it is a baseless, groundless, illegal act to do so. But just this month, Trump was again demanding that the Republicans in Wisconsin cancel the election. So this is just pure lawlessness. This is extremism. This is an attempt to destroy democracy in America. And with the destruction of a democracy comes the destruction of our freedoms, not just the right to vote and the freedom to vote and have that vote count, but all the freedoms that we secure by having elected officials that, at least in theory, are accountable to us and not having some sort of coup. So these are very serious matters. On the question that you posed, about the effort to inject partisanship into Supreme Court races, that's true. It was shocking when North Carolina did that a few years ago. There were North Carolina Republicans. In most states for the last several decades, there's been a commitment to having nonpartisan elections of judges. So judges could be appointed by a governor or they might be elected, but they don't run as a member of a party, because the whole point of a judge is they're supposed to be neutral and fair and not representing a particular party, I guess, unless you're at the highest level of the US Supreme Court, in which you feel no obligation, you have no ethics code whatsoever that binds you. But for all the other courts in the country, the state courts, where there are judicial elections or appointments and then retention elections, in almost every state, those are nonpartisan races. Even though people may hail from a particular party, they don't have a party designation after their name. But what the Republicans in North Carolina did, as you point out, was add partisanship into those elections so they could steer their right-wing voters toward judges who they think will be sure things for the Republican Party agenda. So that's one of the things that's happening.
Yes, and the other thing they did in North Carolina is they made it so they have to run for re-election every 2 years. I would love to talk to you in another show about this constitutional convention, because I just read an article today that, I interviewed Cenk Uygur about it a number of years ago, because he, through his Wolf Pack, is trying to do a constitutional convention, but it's like for the left. In other words, to try to get money out of politics. And Common Cause was always opposing him, and he got into a public war with them because they thought it could be a runaway convention, which was some of the concerns in this article. But I don't want to discuss that because I have another show I have to do right after this. But I do want to close on this independent state legislature theory. So if this happens, it's not just North Carolina that has partisan gerrymandering. Other states have partisan gerrymandering. I don't know them offhand, maybe you do, that, would become legal, and some of these other things. And I'm going to put a link to your research report about those different areas, because we don't have time to get into all of them. But what do you think are the solutions to this? First of all, people are very dubious as to whether Merrick Garland is going to prosecute Trump on the inciting a riot thing. But they think that he's got a stronger case on what he tried to do with these different state officials. So I'm just asking your prediction. Do you think that he is going to prosecute through the Justice Department Trump on that? And second of all, what do you think is the solution to this radical court? I think the only solution is to pack the court, but there doesn't seem to be any appetite in Congress to do that. And you are frozen. Oh my God, this is like the climax of the movie where you ask the most important question and you don't know how it ends.
Well, so to your first question, I am hopeful that the Justice Department prosecutors will pursue the cases where there's evidence that crimes been committed. I think there's ample evidence of crimes being committed by Trump and his inner circle. And just a week ago, Merrick Garland gave an interview in which he repeated or reiterated that no person is above the law. And so I hope to take him at his word, and that these cases and these crimes will be pursued no matter who committed them, including Trump, but not only Trump, because he didn't act alone. I am hopeful also that there is appears to be a criminal proceeding in Georgia about the effort to intimidate Brad Raffensperger and other.
Frozen again. Hopefully she'll come back. Or is it just frozen on my end?
There's a little bit of technical difficulty, but I'll keep going just briefly. Yeah. On the second question you posed, I do think that there are a number of solutions we have to think about, and one of them is unpacking the court, because it's not packing the court, it's unpacking it, because this court has been packed. And it's been packed by deep, dark money. It's been packed to advance a very extreme agenda that is genuinely out of alignment with most Americans. And this court is beginning to implement it. And so I hope that there'll be efforts to expand the court. I think there are also some promising efforts to say that we're going to have mandatory retirement for judges who serve a certain period of time. And that perhaps could reach Alito and Thomas and Roberts pretty early. I think that there's no reason why the court shouldn't be bigger. It's been 9 for more than a century. It's not set in the Constitution. We're a much bigger country. We have far more cases. And this last term, this 9-person Supreme Court had merely 9,000 appeals and only took 66 or 67 of them. And they handpicked, that right-wing majority handpicked the case on abortion, the case on guns, these 3 cases on religion to try to decimate the separation of church and state, the EPA case to try to crush the ability of the EPA to be able to regulate carbon through mechanisms like the Clean Power Plan. They are out of control. They are not a super legislature, and they are so arrogant to believe that they have a right to impose their personal religious and partisan political views on us as law. And we absolutely have to deal with this. We have to restore the balance and confidence on this court. We have to restore we have to have a court that is not at war with a century of legal precedents, which this court is. So I'm with you. I'd love to talk with you more about it. We have to think creatively about solutions, but this court, is one that I think is unworthy of actual respect. And I hate to say it, but this court is out of control, and the decisions they've issued this term just show how out of control they really are.
Absolutely. Well, I'm with you, and it was good to see you after 4 years, and hopefully it won't be another 4 years, because I do want to have you come back to talk about this constitutional convention and how serious a possibility that is. But for now, we've got to leave it there, because in about 7 minutes, I've got Branko Marcetic from Jacobin Magazine and Brett Hartle from the Center for Biological Diversity doing a deep dive into the Mansion energy plan that took everybody by surprise. So thank you very much, Lisa. And everybody, share this show. And I'll see you in 7 minutes.
Thanks, Lauren.
Bye.
Thanks,